want to just start by just setting a kind of a presence of our being with each other, that we come into this room from our days, and we come into this room from our days, maybe our days are unpredictable, you know? So I just want us to also take care of each other and take care of our own energies while we're here, because this time is only supposed to be nourishing. We are here also on these territories which have a history, which have a human presence, which also have a more than human presence. I want to, also take the time to acknowledge the plants and the more than human beings, the birds, the winged ones, as they are referred to, the fish, the bugs, all of the contributors to the energy of these territories, along with the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Wendat people, and acknowledging the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Métis people, the Inuit people, the urban people, and also to take a moment to acknowledge all of our respective ancestors and all of those territories that we also bring with us to these territories. I also want to say that, making trouble takes a community. We have a community of folks here in this room, but there are folks who are not in this room. Justine Woods and Nicole Neidhart in particular have been dreaming this up with me, as well as Ashok Mathur, who has been dreaming this up with us, as well as Jay Urzawa, who is dreaming this up with us, And part of the project is to invite folks who are risk takers in their discipline specific practices, folks who are interested in troubling the way that we experience knowing and knowledge. And we are also, please come on in. Yeah. And we're also here to acknowledge the history of those troublemakers from our respective cultural places of origin. Those troublemakers in this place now known as Canada, those troublemakers are maybe people like Coyote, or Raven. We might use the word trickster. Yeah. But we might also just think of them as powerful people. And speaking of powerful people, I want to acknowledge my dear, dear friend, Kai Recollet, who is offering the first kind of opening up of making trouble in the institution, in our practice, in our being. We are so grateful that you're here with us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'm going to stop talking.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. I also want to just give my gratitude for you all coming today to help share a conversation about trouble. I was introduced to trouble through Peter in all ways. And I think that friends like Peter really trouble an atmospheric that could otherwise try to drown you out. So Peter's been quite a force, I think, and continues to be a force in our communities, urban and otherwise. And it's really nice to feel the presence of someone so grounded in kin and community to come and just have that open expansiveness to reground in other kin and other community, and that capaciousness, that fullness of just an ethic of care and ethic of relationality. So I really appreciate you, Peter. So I wanted to think with you. I wanted to think with you on trouble. I also must say that I'm in the process of finishing up a manuscript this week as well. And it's reading break. So I'm kind of like in multiple spaces at the same time. So I'm hoping that what I share with you, it might not be linear, it might not be progression as this in a sense, but I believe it's more of an assemblage of sort of thoughts and thinking around trouble and around some of the ideas that I've been kind of working with lately. So, troublemaking a glossary is sort of how I wanted to start engaging with trouble. So, troublemaking a glossary. Troublemaking is dangerous. We know that. Troublemaking is risky. Troublemaking is about the breath and the ways in which we are attuned or not attuned to our own breathing. Troublemaking makes me feel hot, like hot flashes, and makes me very thirsty and sometimes a little bit shaky. Troublemaking is speculative, reworlding work. Troublemaking is love work. Troublemaking requires a curious and capacious understanding of relationality. Troublemaking means caring deeply and expansively. Troublemaking calls for witnesses, and it needs all of us. Troubletaking brings me back to my youth and memories of getting into trouble from non-Indigenous adoptive parents that hadn't done their homework. Troublemaking makes me feel powerful, like agentic, the opportunity to dream alternative, possible, beautiful, ancient futures. Troubletaking reminds me of the silences in houses, wishing that someone would talk to me, but knowing that punishment lingers like screaming anyways. Troublemaking reminds me of making haunted houses and inside in planting an ethic of care that is so wondrous and wide that ecologies of regeneration live here. It just doesn't look the same as other versions of regeneration in the light. Maybe we are all gatherers, gathering glitches, slipstreams, and shimmers, and hoping that they stay lit through the darkness. Troublemaking is nuanced, like ceremony, and my ceremonies might not look like your ceremonies. They are oftentimes non-communal. They are more in hiding, alone, with a freedom to move and be just as I am. And that's trouble, right? The star blanket is a troublemaker because I do research on star blankets. Rocks, who I like to think with as well, are certainly troublemakers. And the spider is a troublemaker. And you are a troublemaker. And that's wonderful. Peter shared in one of the early prompts, like having me to think in relation, or inviting me to think in relation, that troublemaking is a multi-directional form of creation. And so I think about a methodology of troublemaking. What does a troublemaking methodology do? And I think that looks like the drawer of all of my notes that I've collected throughout the years. A methodology of multi-directional forms of creation. So I'll just talk a little bit about the methodology of troublemaking. And I think that's great. The methodology of troublemaking. And Peter, isn't there a place for you to sit around here so I can see your face? I know, right?
It's true.
He's such a troublemaker. He's hiding. It's a multi-directional form of creation. So I have been on the lookout for a methodology that embraces trouble, the troubling methodology that embraces haunted houses, rocks, spiders, and star processions to hold it all. I'm looking for some kind of way of thinking, some kind of vessel that can hold all of that. Haunted houses, rocks, spiders, and star processions. And perhaps trouble might be that space, that vessel to hold it, because trouble holds space, I think, for rock and other forms of rebellion. So when I look at this, I didn't bring it, but I have a haunted house. I showed it to you guys in class. Remember, it had like a star glyph on it, like a star blanket.
Yeah.
I forgot to bring it today. I don't know what I was thinking, but the star glyph or star blanket, and have you seen what they look like? They're like gorgeous, indigenous sort of landing glyphs is how I like to think about them. And they come from a story called, a sky being story. And this being was called Achacosa. And star being came down via grandmother spider's thread, sewn sort of like silk thread, and landed. And so the star blanket looks like it is supposed to represent the Pleiades, the hole in the sky from whence star being came down and landed. And then the middle of the star blanket represents the Pleiades. And then there's all these different rays of diamonds that come out on this star blanket. And people use like beautiful colors to create these star blankets. I look at them like landing glyphs. So I also think that they might be like landing craters. So meteorites that have fallen and have displayed out or pushed out all these like rays of ideas and thoughts into the world. So I look at star blankets like these landing craters, the meteor that has dropped our bodies into this slipstream space. And so when I think about these haunted houses, I think about the spaces in between the floorboards. You know how when you're watching like a gothic horror and you can see rays of light coming through the floorboards and coming through the spaces? Well, I think that those are slipstream spaces, and I think that they hold kind of possibilities. So infrastructures of haunted houses being a place to kin make otherwise, a place of regeneration and perhaps relationality. So I think that troublemaking as a methodology provides us with a language to talk about impact zones, to talk about slipstreams, and perhaps to talk about the pushed movements and exiles of Indigenous peoples from their home territories through like residential schools, through 60 scoops. And we can imagine those exiles as sort of like part of a glacial erratic, or ways in which there are certain rocks that have no business being there. And they're actually rocks that were pushed by glaciers, and they become these sort of like erratics, right? This erratic being. And so in a lot of cases, I think that Indigenous people have been dislocated, exiled, forced into different spaces, and have become these kind of glacial erratics out of which we are to build homes, and out of which we're trying to build these infrastructures of care to hold each other and hold ourselves and our children. So I think about troublemaking as a place of play and a place of care, and kind of like a time travel, kind of like a way to stop the time of colonialism, a way to intervene with that time, and perhaps to time travel back so that the conditions of forced exiles didn't happen in the first place. So maybe troubling and the trouble methodology is almost like speculative fiction or speculative histories, and we could kind of activate it that way to rewrite these stories into other kinds of assemblages of experience. So I think that with the haunted houses, and this is where I think that haunted houses can do a lot for our thinking, is that trouble acknowledges that we were not allowed the normality of time. And therefore, as Indigenous peoples, we experience these hauntings because we weren't allowed this normality of time. So that's sort of a connection here, but trouble also requires care. And I've been kind of looking into, writers who talk about a pedagogy of care. And I've been kind of thinking about that, sort of like feminist, new materialist scholars who write about a pedagogy of care, but I'm adding a pedagogy of careful pressure to describe the affective state, a material, vital doing, and that this requires a sense of noticing and responsive attunement. Perhaps for us, a pedagogy of careful pressure can be a practice of creating a series of notes or a series of scores that are built on perhaps the metaphor of the haunted house or other kinds of metaphors. Perhaps a pedagogy of careful pressure is about developing structures and architectures, infrastructures. Perhaps it's a collection of materials that we lay out on tables, on floors, that we use to develop creation of perhaps an archive or a glossary. And in this, my drawer is full of notes and rocks, a pile of rock relations to meditate on 60 scoop experiences of landing into relation or perhaps landing into trouble. And I think that that's important to think about. Perhaps landing into trouble is not as bad as what we have been trained to believe. And also, perhaps these pile of rocks remind me of landing into relation, of landing as opposed to having land relation. And this idea that in order to be whole and full as a human being, I need to have a land relation. What if I had a landing relation and I was able to communicate that to my kin and my chosen kin, and we were able to come to a space of gathering around that? So my trouble is that land haunts me. This is where the trouble is for me, a trouble of land. And my trouble is also the necessity of having to live in glitch spaces, of constantly having to live in these spaces, these slipstream spaces, these glitch spaces, the space in between the floorboards. That's me. So the removal of self from land, the forced exiles of Indigenous peoples from land. Let's talk about what this has created, right? Let's move with that. Let's work with this, not in a way that excuses the violence of exile, of dislocation, of trafficking, let's call it what it is, but in a way that we can move with it. So the removal of self from land, the cavernous otherwise, the space between rock and sedimentation that reveals various practices of holding pressure. Sessing the world as it punctures spaces, carves them out, disrupts. And we can be in those spaces and we can ponder what's next. What if my body reflects this removal, this extraction, this dislocation from certain spatialities that would connect me in ways that I can only speculate? And then I started thinking, rather than completely fall apart from that knowledge, what if we can land upwards instead? Like, what if we imagine ourselves not tethered to land, but tethered to land in the upper atmospheric and the celestial? Because that's really kind of where we came from. So what if we land upwards, as in the stars? And during a conversation that I had in Norway, as we do. No, I'm just kidding. That was the first time I'd ever been. But during a conversation that I had in Norway with my friend Damien Lee, who's a TMU scholar, reflecting on my work, he put it this way. He said, "You kind of meteored into Toronto. So what does it mean when we meteor into place?" I think that's really cool, like to think about it that way. Isn't that a nice sort of hopeful but generative way to think about our landings? In this speculative sorting of things, I lean into rock, and particularly its movements, the ways in which rock holds pressure and releases pressure, the ways in which rock can transform from various states, from like gaseous states into otherwise states, the ways in which rock can literally fly. Isn't that amazing? Rock can fly. So in one of the stories about rock, Um, rock was like, I teach the people how to fly. In a Cree story that was written about by Barry Hennekew, he wrote that rocks teach the people how to fly. And maybe if we were like closer in relation with rock in non anthropomorphic kind of ways, maybe we too could pick up the patterns of movement, the skills, the velocity, the pressure that rock teaches us about, and maybe we can fly. Um, so I think that the ways in which rock absorbs, it holds pressure, it constitutes a sense of place and movement in a way that for me as a diasporic Cree person can really kind of like connect with. Like I can connect, I can vibrate with that atmosphere, I can vibrate with rock. Um, so I think that we can think about our collection of ideas as of notes, of glossaries, as archives, a drawer full of rocks. I know you have a drawer full of something. Like everybody does. So whatever that is that you collect, I think is really important. That this pile of rocks can otherwise be seen as a collection of theories, a collection of worldings, a collection of abolitionist practices, a collection of somatic training on how to hold pressure and release pressure in a good way that you're not harming other people. So I think that, like, I admire kind of the work of feminist scholars in particularly that think about like glossary, that think about archive, that think about assemblages and collections. And I really admire Candace Hopkins' work in Water, Kinship, Belief. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's incredible. There's a lexicon there that I really love, the way that it talks about metaphor, the way that it talks about landing in all these like brilliant, capacious ways, and land and water and rock, particularly here in Toronto. I also kind of in really loving Tanya Lukin Linklater's work, A Glossary of Insistence, and basically all of her work. Eve Tuck's A Glossary of Haunting is another piece that I kind of look up to and love. And then the poetics and the brilliance in like, people like Peter Morin. Like, I know that you don't know him. I know that, like, it's just like he's like a star, right? He's like, how do you share the same space as Peter Morin? But also like Alexis Pauline Gumbs, and particularly the M Archive, and what Alexis has to share about within poetics and Black life and relationalities to more than human kin, and a future archive for a world that is burning, sort of thing. Like that kind of work is something that really moves me. And how do we, and like when we evoke and when we invite pressure as method, I wonder what that inspires you to think about. Like if we were to include careful, like a ethic of care method of pressure as within this sort of like umbrella of troublemaking, what that might offer to the world, and in terms of our thinking about our relations with more than human and other than human kin. So the way that I've kind of tried to put this into some kind of coherence, which I probably failed, but is a series of like glossaries and lexicons. So a glossary for a haunted house, a glossary of rock, a glossary of flight. And I did some crazy Googling the other night looking at like spiders and fun facts about spiders. What do they do and how do they fly? What is a meteorite? Like how are they different from each other? Like how are they formed? What is magma? What are these things? So I started kind of putting together and piecing together some fun facts about things. And and some of the guided prompts that I used in my thinking process was, how do we think with rocks, spiders, and haunted houses, and to what end? How do we decide which rock, which spider, which haunted house gathers us into relation? And I'd really love to do this. As I mentioned, Damian Lee at TMU, he actually used his Shirk money to purchase a mini, like a trailer, and convert that, do you know this? And convert it into a moving lab. So I'm thinking, I would love to be a relational ghost visitor and take my moving lab to various haunted sites around Toronto and out there somewhere, and do some serious like relational work in haunted houses. So who's with me? Okay. All right. Right? How do we visit? How do we be radically relational? How do we feast? How do we know when we're invited? How do we know when when we have consent? What can we learn about these spaces? How does this haunted house gather us into relation? What histories are below the surface of these buildings? So these are the types of inquiry that I'd like to engage. And in thinking about the land haunts us. Like, how else could this be? How else could this be in terms of the land constantly trying to communicate with us what has happened? Like, what has happened? So, and then it got me thinking about, we actually, how do I say this? Okay, so you know how meteorites kind of land and they fall rather violently, I would say. Like, that's pretty violent. I mean, they probably wiped out the dinosaurs. So their impact is massive. At a geoscale, I'm just going to throw out that word. I don't know. Geoscale. Geoscalular landings that, that had massive impacts. The ways in which colonialism, conquest, like massively impacted us. So much so that we had to go underground. Like, we had to hunker down. Like, our practices had to hunker down. Our visiting practices, our relational practices, all of that had to go underground. So our people are also haunted by the underneath as much as we thrive there. Because I think we did. I think we did. I think we could thrive anywhere. So our experiences of being underground in both the sky world undergrounds and the underneath have impacted us. And so I was not so recently, but maybe about 3-4 years ago, my cousin, who I discovered she is my cousin, Sylvia McAdam, she's my dad's niece. Anyway, so she's my cousin. And Sylvia McAdam was talking about this land prophecy. And I was so interested in this because it was about the underneath. And this land prophecy shapes for me, this more than human kin listening through considering ferality as an underground landing strategy. Like, how do we be feral? How do we hold pressure when in an atmospheric of rock and sediment and fire and whatever the heck else is under there? So Sylvia shared this land prophecy about a future land burn that will require us to sustain ourselves by establishing relationships with depth. McAdam shares that when the earth is going through the burning time, it's going to be called the burning time, the northern animals will die out, and when they do, the people will panic. The southern animals will begin to move to the north, devour the northern animals, okay, this is pretty hopeful, and then disappear. McAdam recounts that even when you go to the water from the lakes and rivers, even the water will burn. If you don't have your prayers, your songs, connection with the Creator, you'll be very challenged on how to call for the animals through our songs. The only thing left to eat will be deep in the ground, the frogs, the snakes, the creatures, and you need to have the songs to call them forth. So I just want to tell you something hilarious, because it was in Kingston when I was visiting with you and Dylan, when I was talking to my partner John on the phone. And I said, we're going to have to learn the worm songs. And he's like, what? And I said, we're going to have to learn the worm songs. Like, Sylvia, like, we need to learn what the songs of the worms are so we can eat the worms. And him, he's hilarious. He's like this white guy. He's like, I know the worm songs. I'm like, you do not. And he's like, no, I know the worm songs. And I'm like, what are they? And he goes like this. Oh, you can't hear it. You gotta hear it. I'm like, what? How is that a worm song? He says, well, you mimic rain, and then the worms come out. And this is coming from a white guy. You know, he's got this prophecy all figured out or something. I'm like, okay. So then I started like thinking about that and thinking about, and I have to say this is out of relation with Alexis Pauline Gumb's work in the M Archive. If you haven't read it, oh my gosh, you should read it like tonight. It is gorgeous. Okay, and I'm calling this a future archive, and this is in response and in relation, I want to say, in gratitude for Alexis's writing. Okay, a future archive. I'm just going to take a sip of my tea. Okay. They listened to Sylvia McAdams' video from the archive, the one where her elders, my elders, shared this moment in time when the songs of the worms, the knowledge of the worms, and how to live in darkness emerged. We must observe the worms for how they organize, how they gather, and share bioluminescence. I just thought that maybe they should have bioluminescence through bone, mercury, to illuminate our fears so that we can break open to that space where we are finally in communion with each other. It is okay to be afraid, as Sean Crawley says. I also love a Sean Crawley. In this moment of time when we open ourselves up to heartbreak, to dealing, to feeling, and a feelingness of letting go. Sometimes to breathe through the burn also means that we have to become subterrestrial. We have deep-rooted relationships with underground practices. Let's hope that this relational genealogical strategy works for us. We tried our schedules to maintain a sense of self within that moment of social distancing, but we soon realized that these schedules were born not of bone, but of a skeleton of production that only maximized our guilt, our shared shame, in our inabilities to maintain an unrealistic, inhuman form of being. We instead laid down, we rested, we played with our little podlings, learned how to use our gills to begin to breathe underwater, to become riparian as we were meant to. Instead, we established our connections with water beings, asked for consent in ways that we had never imagined, but that were necessary. We learned to seep ourselves into spaces, to not impose ourselves, but rather a more gentler, gradual kind of visiting that acknowledged our ways of being gentle and tender with one another. Taking our time to be in spaces that acknowledged our own body autonomy and others. Visiting, entering became a process, a trail, a slow gesture into spaces. We gently asked the old ones while we prepared tea for them to help us to learn the worm songs. Like gentle rain songs, they became a part of us so that we realized that these songs were for everyone, to keep us safe. We began teaching the young ones to enter those spaces between sister atmospheres and to breathe with gills underwater, and to teach them how to use their eyelids in creative ways, to perceive bioluminescence that lived inside of them, to seek out future kin underwater, under earth. To play with the sinuous rhizomes, respectively follow their paths to seek water. We learned through our sings that the earth's core was beautiful, that it was welcoming, that it was emergent. We learned how to breathe in rock, through sand, through soil. We learned how to love ourselves again, how to love others, and that we could rise and fall in darkness. We imagine a world different as people are reaching outwards, inwardly, celestially, and deep to imagine and activate different futures. So, a glossary of a haunted house. So haunted houses are trouble, like for obvious reasons, but we had to build worlds to make up for missing kin. That is why I wanted to think with you on this, the relationship between haunted houses and a methodology of trouble through embracing careful pressure, which brings in an ethics of care to the work that we do, which has always been, I imagine, while acknowledging pressure and rupture and the possibilities of world endings over and over and over again. So I like this one. Well, I like them all, sorry. Sorry, I'm gonna start with this one, how's that? So the celestial form of this haunted house is mirroring the same constellations that are probably up above it at this particular moment. So the celestial form of a giant scoop in the sky, and I think we know what we're talking about, like the Big Dipper. Within a lens of trouble, within the lens of a pedagogy of careful pressure, we can think about forced exiles into different spaces as sort of scoops, right? Scoops. But also in relationship with what Wilfred Buck, who's this awesome Cree astronomer, talks about, Mista Musqua, which is the Big Dipper, the celestial scoop. So this becomes a concept that I lean into that becomes a metaphor, a methodology of trouble and the application of careful pressure. That's risky, right? To call the scoop the Big Dipper, to think about Toronto as the dish with one spoon, and to place those in conversation with each other. But that's why a careful pressure is necessary, or else it could be interpreted as this was written in the stars, these forced dislocations, these forced violences. So we have to be careful when we're making and stirring up trouble and putting things into relation. And that's where the ethic of care comes in. It's a doing. Care is a doing. It's a material, vital doing, according to Maria de la Bellicasa. And care makes sense within a project that centers 60 scoop diasporic moves as meditating on this complicated relationship between being in care and the community impacts of disappearance. And here I evoke the haunted house as well. As my birth father told me, I came to the hospital and you were gone. And in those days, once they took you, you were really gone. So again, I evoke the haunted house and the spectral kind of presences. But I also kind of need to, when I apply a careful pressure pedagogy, I also look to Saidiya Hartman's work to, in particular, this piece that Saidiya writes, Venus in Two Acts. When I think about the trafficking of children, I also I'm connecting to rock and other more than human kin in ways that I need to be careful not to fill in gaps and be speculative about real agential beings because I have a need to connect in some way. Sometimes for 60 scoopers, it might be easier to connect with land kin than it is to connect with real kin. And there's a troubling there. It's a little bit uncomfortable. So Saidiya Hartman helps me to kind of work some of that stuff out. So as a ward of the state, and within an ongoing policy of extractivist dispossession through the trafficking of Indigenous children, I wanted to see if a pedagogy of care can help me think with and alongside the materialisms and haunting affect of dislocation through working with fabric, stitching, assemblage making, tarot card, trade card making, haunted houses. As a 60 scoop survivor myself, I wanted to learn how to make an assemblage of trouble, to think with Miss Damasqua, the Big Dipper, the dish with one spoon, the 60 scoop together, which requires careful pressure and precision. It was no surprise for me when I started to look up that I was starting to like find my constellations there ever since I was a kid. And in doing this work, you know, I'm thinking about enactments of care located in the practice of writing relations, and meditating on the question, how do we care otherwise? And then to place that kind of like questioning to these haunted houses, to ask, how do we care otherwise? How do we care when all we have growing up is speculative kin? Or when we've, you know, had forced removals, how do we find kinship in the stars and in the stars' pathways, those pathways of the stars too? And how do we grapple with uneasy assumptions about care? So then I started going into that place and thinking about trouble being an intentional practice of taking risks and asking questions that disrupt, challenge, and invalidate settler colonial infrastructures of violence, and questioning these seemingly innocent practices of benevolence and the containment of bodies in care through the state-sanctioned child apprehension system impacting Indigenous children. Trouble methodology of applying careful pressure looks to me like an assemblage of thinking with these haunted houses and relations with more or other than human kin and cosmologies as a form of recuperating and imagining anew care. So I'm just going to keep going with, I wanted to switch a little bit. So a methodology of troublemaking might require the activation of a processual care otherwise. And a processual care otherwise, to me, looks like the spider's web, and how Achakosisqueo came down through the mentorship of a grandmother spider who curated this webbed, woven assemblage for the future. So our care might hold the space collectively as a procession. The Milky Way as a procession, spider webs as a procession, this spider house as a procession. And the spider teaches us how to hold pressure in a careful, curated space of slipstream weaving practice. So then when I think about like rocks, I read some fun facts about spiders, and spiders and rocks are really vibrational creatures. They feel vibrations, they sense vibrations, they hold memory. Of course, a spider has a different, you know, they kind of want to capture, which kind of, I was trying to think about, okay, well, what does that mean in all of this? But they really vibe with vibrations, so I'm just going to keep it there. They are vibrational forces. Rocks are vibrational forces. Rocks also shimmer, and rocks also haunt. Rocks do make very interesting strangers, a kind of haunting specter-like presence that when gathered, when assembled, and here I am thinking about rock as bone. Rock matter is that which encases ligaments, femurs, spillage of marrow, ancestral shapes and forms encasing a long memory. These beings, as I pile them or terraformulate them into shapes on a table, produce a speculative architecture of old bones that binds me to them in a forever haunting. Rocks become haunted houses. Meteorites, and I know I shared some of my thinking about meteorites earlier, so I'll just kind of move forward a little bit and share with you my new work on meteorites. And here, you know, haunted houses, leaky roofs, water. When we're thinking about place-based research and the expectations of Indigenous scholars to do place-based research, what if that place is a ruin? How do we articulate that in the work that we do without others co-opting that and saying, well, spaces and place and land is not meaningful to keep or to land back? Like, there has to be space for all of this. And that's kind of the trouble, I think. And that's the trouble of my research and what it does, because it could be co-opted to say and used against me to say, well, if you're not land-based, rhizomatically rooted downward, then you don't need this land back, right? So there is a risk that it will be turned into something else, that there isn't space for all of this. And certainly that's not the intention. And then I think about like what happens when you are inviting yourself into a haunted house. What happens when all that's left is sort of like this creepy old furniture with this creepy old star blanket wrapped around it, and to find some kind of kinship with that. So the haunted house evokes those kind of like imaginaries where you can imagine like kin actually being speculative presences when you have been exiled from your family, and where you are sort of like relationally deficient. That the haunted houses could offer some kind of refuge in that sense. So I think that shimmery people are shimmery. This is our conversation at McDonald's like a couple weeks ago. We talked about shimmery people. So shimmery people are shimmery because of the ruptures that exist in the cavernous spaces between the shimmer. They have just learned how to reflect and give them light. Maybe landing in careful pressure is a process of suturing the dislocated fractals while allowing for the agency of these fractals. The haunted house haunts me because of private property, the claiming of space and bodies, and the removal from the collective responsibility and care. Haunted houses also evoke these glimpses out of the corner of your eye of a relation, as a relation that is there and not quite there, and that is built within a particular atmospheric. People cover up mirrors, people like do all of these things with haunted houses, but maybe they're covering up the possibility of kin relationality. So haunting is a residue of kinstillatory care, I think. Like haunted houses are residues of kinstillatory care. They're like loopings of like family stories, loopings of genealogies that can actually produce something quite meaningful and lovely. They're memories, they're future memories, and they want to be heard, they want to be visibilized, they want to be seen, they want to be recognized, and they want to reach out and touch you. So when that creepy hand comes on your shoulder, who knows, it could be Uncle Bob. So all of this matter within these spaces matters. And then I thought about, I'm doing a lot of stuff and I'm not sure if it's landing okay, but I'm just going to keep going. So I think about rocks a lot too. And do you know that there's concepts in Indigenous languages that are like really badass? Like there's this one concept, and I thought about this in relationship to Joy Arcan's work on trading cards. Joy Arcan produced these neckbone woman, like crazy superhero trading cards, and they're amazing. So then I thought about Cree trading cards and actually Joy Arcan is Cree, so those are Cree trading cards, but Cree geological or kinstillithic trading cards and what those might look like. And there are concepts in Cree that are like amazing for talking about different kinds of stones, the meteors, stars falling, the ways in which Cree is spoken as a form of rock Cree. There's a group of folks called rock Cree. So rock Cree, words in Cree that express the way that rocks sound when they talk to each other. Yeah. Like, doesn't that just blow your mind? Like, what? There's a word that talks about the sound of rocks talking to each other. I have been searching for that my entire life. I just need to know. And then there's another concept, and I don't want to say it in Cree because I'm not sure how I will do in this situation. Pimote, kote, kotao, tamipik means walking underwater. So there's these old words in Cree for walking underwater. It's just kind of like, wow, what? And so rocks are worlders. Rocks are not only rocks of themselves, they also have a series of kinships and relationships with other more than human kinships. So rock consciousness is also connected to water consciousness, is also connected to buffalo consciousness, is also connected to salmon consciousness, is also connected to celestial body consciousness, is also connected with cedar, lichen, moss consciousness, and other relational knowledges and affectual mattering. I would say the same with the haunted house, that these haunted houses are also connected to water consciousness and the seepage of water and spillages of other more than human and other human relations. And maybe that's what people think they are haunted, because they're actually more in relationship with landing and land and more than human relations than how we like to, clean our houses and keep them free of all that. So I'm just gonna quickly go through. How are y'all doing? How are you? I have some more thoughts about like meteorites and thinking about relationships between 60 scoopers and meteorites. Maybe I'll just read this and I'll end it there. It is okay. Let me give you some fun facts about meteorites first. So meteorites are mostly composed of silicate minerals, but the great majority also contain metallic iron in small scattered grains. Iron meteorites are mostly made of iron and nickel. Most space rocks, smaller than a football, will break apart in the Earth's atmosphere, traveling at tens of thousands of miles per hour. The object disintegrates as pressure exceeds the strength of the object, resulting in a bright flare. Less than 5% of the original object usually makes it down to the ground. That's a fun fact from NASA. So meteorites are interesting that they tell of a deep time, the age and composition of different world-building moments, planetary building blocks. They represent some of the original diverse materials that formed planets billions of years ago. It is hard as a 60 scooper to be able to imagine such forms of deep time, as in the slipstream that happens in space, that these are materials that formed planets billions of years ago. The materiality of meteorites are maps to tell us to what degree in which materials were shocked by the impacts of the past. Can my surface flesh be read like meteorite? Through studying meteorites, we can also discern the temperatures it achieved at surfaces and the interior temperature of asteroids. When is heat and pressure theory? And can this way of thinking help me to understand embodied exile and how to work with it to shape different kinds of futures, or how to lean into to create otherwise kin? Can my pressure be in conversation with meteorites' pressure? Can belongingness come through and within the rock nation as a way of connecting to deep time, to a genealogy of becomingness? And then I just kind of go on and on about like rocks and sediment and magma.